Washington Talk, I'm Eun-jung Cho. Ahead of a fresh round of working-level talks, the United States made clear its goal remains the complete elimination of all of North Korea's weapons of mass destruction. North Korea, meanwhile, emphasizes trust-building measures will lead to results. What does North Korea hope to achieve?
We obviously clearly want to see the complete elimination of WMDs in North Korea.
아까 이런 훌륭한 관계가 남들이 예상 못하는 그런 계속 좋은 일들을 계속 만들면서
In the studio with me today, Mr. Michael Fuchs, Senior Fellow at the Center for American Progress. Mr. Fuchs served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs from 2013 to 2016. Also joining me, Mr. Scott Snyder, Director of U.S.-Korea Policy Program at the Council on Foreign Relations. Mr. Snyder has authored numerous books on Korean politics and foreign policy and Asian regionalism. Welcome to the program.
Thank you. Thank you.
Now, Mr. Snyder, let me begin with you. Prior to the working-level talks, North Korea is emphasizing trust. Propaganda outlet Meari said that the DMZ meeting showed the importance of trust and it could lead to unimaginable results. And another outlet, Joseon Shinbo, also said the United States should take trust-building measures first, and North Korea is ready to reciprocate with goodwill gestures. So what kind of trust is North Korea seeking?
Well, I think the kind of trust that North Korea is looking for is the kind of trust that would enable the United States and North Korea to establish a geostrategic relationship. That North Korea basically wants to be recognized as a valuable actor, especially as a nuclear weapons possessing state. But I don't think that that is the kind of trust relationship that the United States has in mind for the relationship with North Korea.
Mm-hmm.
No, look, I completely agree with Scott. I think that this is one of the fundamental gaps in between North Korea and the United States, and has been for a long time. North Korea wants recognition now, of course, as a nuclear power. They want recognition as a leader on the world stage. Kim Jong-un's summits in the last year, of course, have shown him to play the role of the statesman, and he clearly likes that. And so I think that what they want to see from the United States is a little bit of recognition for that. And I think that's why Kim Jong-un really likes what Donald Trump has given him, I think, over the last year with these three summits. But of course, this is not how the United States views it. The United States wants North Korea to make some credible concessions on the nuclear program. And for the United States, that's how you build trust.
Now, on this issue of trust, Assistant Secretary of State Department's Intelligence and Analysis Department said that Chairman Kim Jong-un holds this deep-seated mistrust that the United States is seeking regime change of his country. Now, has this been the case? Do you see any signs that the United States is seeking regime change in North Korea?
Well, look, it's not that hard to understand why Kim Jong-un and many in his regime and many in North Korea believe that, because of the level of hostilities over the last 60-plus years. But I think fundamentally here, the United States has made clear for a long time that regime change is not the policy here. What they want to see is behavior change from North Korea. But again, this gets back to this fundamental gap between the two countries and how they see one another. And North Korea and Kim Jong-un Kim Jong-un in particular, obviously, and his regime, want regime survival. He wants to stay in power. And he sees everything the United States does over the years as threatening that regime, whether or not that is actually the intention of the United States.
Mm-hmm. And Assistant Secretary of INR also said that Kim Jong-un considers President Trump as different, and that he believes the United States will not attack North Korea militarily. So do you think more than ever now is the time for the United States and North Korea to build trust?
Well, it can only be done through cooperation on both sides on a mutually defined area of work. It has to be backed by verification. And so that's the reason why the denuclearization project is important from a U.S. perspective, is that it would enable North Korea to indicate steps that it would take in order to denuclearize, together with U.S. steps, presumably, towards tension reduction and peace building. as a means by which to identify a set of actions that both sides can point to that would overcome some of this kind of mistrust. But I think the really interesting question is about why is Kim Jong-un investing so much hope in the relationship with Trump himself? And what is the danger related to the idea of developing a personal relationship really almost at the expense of trying to address the mistrust that exists between the two governments? And that's the reason why, if it's just about Trump and Kim, it's not enough. We've got to go further than that, or after Trump, nothing will have changed.
I also think that this is part of the problem as well. I think Scott is exactly right. President Trump is dealing with Kim Jong-un, frankly, the way that President Trump deals with most other leaders. It's about the personal relationship. President Trump believes fundamentally that foreign policy is about getting in a room with another leader, and if he does that, President Trump believes that he'll just be able to convince that other leader of whatever it is that President Trump wants. And so he believes that that's the way to make progress with North Korea, but I think that Scott hit the nail on the head, that they're missing how to address the bigger problems, the fundamental problems in the relationship.
Right, but wouldn't political will from the leaders give more room for diplomacy for the working level officials?
Well, in theory, it might, and I think that's the reason why one of the results of this particular DMZ meeting was a pledge that the working level process was going to be started. But here we are. This is really the third time, and either the third time is going to be a charm, and working level talks will actually develop and create a substantive result, or the third time is going to prove that diplomacy is not going to be effective under these circumstances. And in fact, the gap between the U.S. and North Korea is enduring. So there are great risks, I think, now that the leaders have met 3 times, that if it doesn't produce anything substantive, that really people are just going to throw up their hands and say, well, there's no hope for these two sides to close the gap.
Mm-hmm. And Secretary Pompeo said that working level talks will likely resume mid-July, and it's already mid-July. And Deputy National Security Advisor for Korea, Kim Yong-jong, he said that U.S. and South Korea are still waiting for North Korea to respond to the offer. So would this happen anytime soon? What do you think? Are we still on schedule?
Well, look, I think it's a little bit of a case of deja vu, potentially. A year ago, we were seemingly at the same situation, almost. The two leaders met in a surprising first ever meeting in Singapore. And the promise was then that a process was going to get started between the two countries. But save for a couple of visits by Secretary Pompeo to Pyongyang over the ensuing months, the working levels were not actually able to meet. And by all accounts, this was in large part due to North Korea sort of stringing the U.S. team along, delaying, not responding. And so in many ways, this may be a tactic by North Korea to buy time.
Mm-hmm. Now, State Department said that freezing of North Korean nuclear materials would be the beginning of this step, and then the ultimate goal is the total elimination of WMD. For the first time, publicly saying that freezing would be the beginning of the goal. Now, Washington Post says that it is no secret and no news that the Special Representative Began and his team are going for the interim deal. What is your take?
Well, I think the prior step that really remains to be seen how the two sides are going to deal with it is that we need an understanding about what complete denuclearization means. And that was the big sticking point, I think, in Hanoi, actually. Aside from the issue of whether we're going to deal with the North Korean nuclear program in one bite or in several bites. But really, you can't begin a process and have it lead to the desired destination unless you've defined the destination. Mm-hmm. And so I still think that that remains to be done. And what the State Department may be signaling is an acceptance of the idea that in terms of implementation, the process is going to require multiple steps. But unless and until both sides can affirm and define what they mean by complete denuclearization, I think it's going to be very hard to get that process started. So what I'm actually most concerned about is we get back to working level talks and the gap is further exposed as an unbridgeable gap on the definition of complete denuclearization. Mm-hmm.
South Korean media reports that United States is considering giving suspension to sanctions for 12 to 18 months on North Korean textiles and coals in return for dismantling of Yongbyon and a freeze of its nuclear programs. And State Department Special Representative Began categorically denied this, and this is no truth and it's not totally false. What do you make of it? There was a New York Times reporting about United States going for a freeze. So is there a lot of brainstorming going on, or are there interested parties leaking their own agenda to the media?
Well, I think it's a little bit of both. This is the game as it's played, right, in Seoul and in Washington and in Pyongyang as well. Everyone is jostling for what they think is the right approach, and sometimes you're going to leak some of that information to get out your side of things and maybe to box in someone else. But I think fundamentally what we've seen probably over the last year plus as these talks have gone on is brainstorming on all sides, frankly, as to what the options are. And so whether or not this report in particular is true, I think that it's probably fair to say that the U.S. team and all teams right now are trying to figure out what kinds of deals would they be willing to put on the table and would they be willing to actually accept. And this freeze may be similar to something that they are actually considering.
Mm-hmm. So we've been talking about the trust issue and North Korea fearing the United States seeking regime change. So North Korea has been asking for security guarantees. But at the Hanoi summit, North Korea wanted sanctions relief. So is it North Korea's focus is shifting, or is it more of a short-term goal of a sanctions relief and a long-term goal of a security guarantee?
I think what the North Koreans have always wanted is the security guarantees, but they have some short-term needs in terms of relieving the pressure that is coming from sanctions. Really what the North Koreans have always said is that they want the U.S. to change its position from having a hostile relationship with Pyongyang to essentially a geostrategic relationship, one in which North Korea becomes a friend of the United States rather than an enemy. What that does is it gives the North Koreans incredible geostrategic leverage in Northeast Asia. But what it also implicitly means is that the U.S. is betraying its South Korean ally. And I actually think that that is a problem, because if we betray our South Korean ally in order to have a geostrategic relationship with Pyongyang, how is Pyongyang ever going to trust the United States? So I think there's a fatal flaw in the North Korean approach of trying to win the U.S. over to its side and against the South Korean side.
Mm-hmm. And at the working level talks, U.S. is very clear that there is no sanctions relief before denuclearization. So at the talks, what can the U.S. offer?
Well, I think that I would question whether or not that still is the case, that the United States will not consider sanctions relief before denuclearization. Obviously, in public, I think that the United States, while it's gone back and forth, has to maintain a hard line. I think that President Trump's personal interest in this process, his willingness to meet Kim Jong-un regularly. He's clearly interested in some sort of progress. And my view, at least, is that there is going to be no progress unless the United States is willing to give up on some sort of sanctions relief. And so I think that these two just are not going to, they're not going to be able to maintain, the U.S. is not going to be able to maintain this hard line.
I mean, from Trump's perspective, in my view, at this point, this has become a political issue. And so what did he do at the DMZ? The first thing he did was to showcase the relationship. And we're going to be hearing about the relationship constantly as Trump goes on the campaign trail. But then what does that mean about the scope of a deal that Trump needs? It actually means he just needs something, an agreement with North Korea to get through the next 12 to 18 months. And so I think that that actually means that there's an increasing likelihood that we might see what a lot of people are going to call a bad deal, and an increasing likelihood that we'll see some kind of concessions on sanctions relief that would be just enough to get us through that time frame.
Mm-hmm. Scott said that there's a likely that we may see a bad deal. So if the U.S. side comes up with an interim deal that falls short of complete denuclearization, what would be the domestic reaction?
Well, look, I actually think that first, I think that an interim deal, if that's what we want to call it, is probably the only realistic option. My personal view is that we're not going to get a deal in the immediate future on complete denuclearization. And so the best way to approach these talks is actually with some sort of interim deal where the North Koreans give up, whether it's Yongbyon or Yongbyon plus something else, in exchange for some sort of sanctions relief, so that show both sides that they're willing to make real concessions. I think that that's necessary. But fundamentally, I think politically, I think Trump has more or less neutralized this as a political issue in the United States. As long as Kim Jong-un does not resume the 2017 level and pace of testing of both nukes and missiles, I think that President Trump has shown over the last year that he's going to continue to portray this as a victory, and how he has changed the relationship, that he has supposedly saved America from something disastrous. And I think that if the status quo maintains, the president is going to continue to do that.
And Scott, last question. So North Korea's Chosun Shinbo said that United States needs to come with a practical proposal, only demanding as much as it is willing to act. What is North Korea messaging? What is North Korea's position right now?
I believe that that was an invitation to the United States to continue to negotiate with ourselves as a prerequisite to coming to talks to North Korea, and then the North Koreans will cherry pick the proposal and the characteristics of the approach that is most beneficial to North Korea as its focus and as what it might be willing to step toward in terms of making some kind of smaller agreement that can actually get us through the next 12 to 18 months.
Well, we'll have to leave our conversation here and now watch video for our next discussion.
従来、韓国に対して実施してきた優遇措置をやめて
사태가 장기화될 가능성을 배제할 수 없습니다. 모든 가능성에 대비하지 않으면 안 됩니다.
Seoul and Tokyo's row over history is becoming a full-blown economic confrontation. President Moon called it unprecedented emergency in relations with Japan. South Korean officials are also seeking U.S. help. Now, Mr. Fuchs, how does this row impact the United States economically and diplomatically? Is the United States in an awkward position right now?
Yes, I think is the short answer. I mean, economically, obviously, it can have a potential impact. Japan and South Korea are both some of the world's biggest economies and some of America's biggest trading partners. And so if there is an economic problem between the two of them, it could create some serious economic problems for the United States. But more fundamentally, I think it's about North Korea and China. And working closely with Japan and South Korea are absolutely vital, both to the North Korea effort as well as to the increasing tensions, obviously, between the United States and China. And Washington wants to be on the same page with both its allies in Seoul and Tokyo. But the worse that relations get between these two American allies, the worse it's going to be for U.S. efforts to coordinate its policies when it comes to either North Korea or China.
And Japan, in strengthening its export control, questioned the credibility of Seoul's sanctions against North Korea. What can we glean from this?
Well, Abe defined this as the reason why Japan cannot trust South Korea. And so one thing I think it shows is that Japan and Prime Minister Abe, does have a serious problem in terms of his perception of South Korea as a trustworthy actor. But I think that the target of Abe's criticism is misplaced because there simply is not yet evidence that South Korea has been a willing breaker of the sanctions regime with North Korea. In fact, privately, I've heard State Department personnel state that South Korea has been quite assiduous in meeting a lot of its obligations with regard to enforcement of sanctions. And so very interesting that the South Korean government has proposed an international investigatory body to take a look at this issue. They're probably doing that as a means by which to show that they are doing a good job. But the danger of that proposal is that Japan is probably going to want to link it to some kind of investigatory body or arbitration body to address the issue of forced labor. And so it's going to be very interesting to see how that plays out.
Mm-hmm. And Mr. Fuchs, while you were in office, Deputy Assistant Secretary for East Asian Affairs from 2013 to 2016, what were some of the notable actions taken to mediate between Seoul and Tokyo?
Yeah, obviously the rough relations between the two countries goes back quite a ways. And in the second Obama term, there was a significant amount of effort taken by the Obama administration, by the United States, to try to make sure that the relationship did not descend down this negative spiral like we're seeing right now. There were a number of regular trilateral meetings between the three at the deputy minister level, in addition to leader-level summits that took place. And that, of course, was in addition to the behind-the-scenes work that was sort of continuous and ongoing for the United States to try to find a way to make sure that without taking sides, the two allies were not getting too far apart.
I just want to add that the failure of the Trump administration to continue that deputy minister level consultation, I think, is one of the things that deprives us of instruments by which to address this issue right now.
And Assistant Secretary Stilwell is on his Asia trip. Would this be a good opportunity for the three sides to meet? Because South Korea's Deputy National Security Advisor said that currently there are talks to arrange some kind of high-level meeting between the three countries.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I hope that Assistant Secretary Stilwell is going to have this at the top of his agenda when he's on his trip. But I think, as Scott was pointing out, I think unfortunately it's gone beyond that now. This is about the highest levels in Seoul and Tokyo. I think the two leaders of those countries right now are complete loggerheads over this issue, and it is clearly spiraling out of control. And so I think the only thing that could potentially help from the U.S. side is actually President Trump getting involved, which of course raises a number of serious questions, and I don't know exactly how it would play out if the president were to get involved, because he has been very close, obviously, with Prime Minister Abe over his first couple of years, and not particularly close to President Moon. But that being said, the president's priority right now in Northeast Asia very much seems to be North Korea, which means he's much more on the same page with President Moon than he is with Prime Minister Abe. And so if the president were to get involved, I think there's obviously a very big question as to where he might actually be on this issue.
Fundamentally, though, isn't this between Seoul and Tokyo, and there's only so much the U.S. can do?
I think that's right, and I think that's exactly the point that Mike was just making, that South Korea and Japan, the governments and the leaders, need to think carefully about how to try to roll this back, how to reduce the influence of the domestic political component of their respective agendas, and to prioritize the critical importance of a stable and normal relationship between South Korea and Japan, really as a critical component of their national interest.
Well, we have so much more to talk about, but we'll have to wrap it here and move on to our next segment. Now, time for the photo moment, time to look at an interesting North Korea picture. Today, we have a photo of pedestrians in Pyongyang stopping on the streets and offering a silent tribute, marking the 25th anniversary of the death of Kim Il-sung. Sirens rang for 3 minutes, and people bowed their heads in the direction of the Kumsusan Palace of the Sun, where Kim Il-sung's embalmed body lies. Scott, what's your reaction?
It's really striking, because usually what we're seeing is the line of the leadership paying respects to Kim Il-sung. But I think that this is a reminder that political loyalty in North Korea knows no bounds, and that point is emphasized in daily life continuously for the average North Korean.
Mike?
Yeah, I agree with Scott, and I also, frankly, hope that President Trump sees this picture and many like it. I think, unfortunately, in President Trump's engagements with Kim Jong-un over the last year, these kinds of pictures have been forgotten, and he does not fully understand what life is like in North Korea, how oppressive it is, how regime loyalty and shows of it like this are strictly mandated and enforced. And so even though we need to engage with North Korea, I would very much like for the U.S. president to keep in mind what kind of a leader he is dealing with.
Well, on that note, we'll wrap it here. Mr. Snyder, Mr. Fuchs, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And this was Washington Talk from the Voice of America, and I'm Eun Jung Cho. Join us next week for more analysis on North Korea.